My name is Kara Forster. I'm the Forest Program Director at the Watershed Center, and I coordinate the Vrain Forest Health Partnership. Curious how many folks in the room have heard of the Vrain Forest Health Partnership before? Awesome, and the radio has too. Cool. Well, this event was majorly planned by Boulder Valley Longmont Conservation Districts and Leaston Dell right here. And the partnership is a collaborative of different agencies and organizations. Those range from municipalities like City of Longmont, for example, to fire protection districts like Allenspark FPD, to NGOs like the Watershed Center, as well as conservation districts, the whole alphabet soup. And we're really lucky because we all work together to increase community and ecosystem resilience to wildfire. But we've also been getting a lot of questions about mountain pine beetle, which is a slightly different issue than wildfire, obviously, but everything is interconnected in ecology. So we're excited to talk more with you tonight and learn with you. I'm just going to do a quick shout out of the different organizations that are in the room. So after, you can feel free to walk up to folks and ask questions. And we can just kind of get a sense of all the awesome partners that came out tonight. So we've got Colorado State Forest Service. Maybe wave your hand if you're from these organizations. Colorado State Forest Service, Boulder County, and Boulder County Wildfire Partners. Boulder Valley Longmont Conservation District, so you've got a couple here. The Watershed Center, a couple on either, we're surrounding you on all sides. Allenspark Fire Protection District, awesome. Estes Valley Fire Protection District, and did I miss any? Awesome.
Oh, we're a little whatever conservation.
Oh, awesome. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Always growing partnerships. I'm really grateful to Highlands Camp and Retreat Center for hosting us tonight. We give awesome. So with that, I'm not going to talk too much longer. I just wanted to let you know that all of these awesome resources are available to support further conversations. So this is not one time, come in, leave. We're always here to provide further resources and answer any questions you might have. With that, I'm going to pass it to Emily to kick us off.
Thank you, Kiara. Good evening, everyone. My name is Emily Spindell. I'm forester with the Boulder Valley Longmont Conservation District. I just want to say thank you again so much for making it out this evening here in person and online. Yeah, thank you for being here to learn more about mountain pine beetle from our state's foremost expert, Dr. Dan West. Dr. West serves as Colorado's entomologist with the Colorado State Forest Service, where he leads statewide forest health monitoring and response efforts. His work integrates aerial detection surveys, applied research, and science-based management strategies to address emerging insect and disease threats across Colorado's forests. Specializing in bark beetle ecology and insect-tree interactions, Dr. West works closely with landowners, with communities, and with partner agencies to strengthen forest resilience. He has also taught forest entomology at Colorado State University for the past 14 years, creating field-based forest health experience into university instruction. Dr. West earned his Bachelor of Science in Forestry and his Master of Science and PhD in Entomology, both from CSU, and previously worked with the U.S. Forest Service and U.S. Geological Survey studying insect-driven forest change throughout the Western U.S. Dr. West, thank you so much for presenting and leading this conversation this evening. I'll go ahead and hand it off to you.
Thank you. Will you do me a favor and hit the lights? I don't want anybody to take a nap, but hopefully you can kind of see this. And is this helping at all? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you everybody for coming out. As already said, I do a lot of talking at university and across the state. So some of you may have seen me already. Feel free to ask questions as we go. I understand that it's difficult to remember questions until the end of all this. So if you've got a burning question, just shout it out. Don't feel like you've got to wave a hand or anything. Just ask your question. We're all here to learn. No stupid questions, ask away. I just kind of pulled some slides together to give us something to talk about. Sorry, Meg, I'll try not to get in the way of this from you. And so this is not all encompassing, but if you've got questions about biology and stuff, which I didn't put a lot of in here, feel free, if you've got questions about management and all that, just feel free to ask. And with that, I think I'll just kind of get started here. Well, maybe. Maybe not. Yep. Oh, yeah, well, I couldn't do it manually either. It's like stuck.
It's because it's on. There you go. Nice work.
Roger that. Yep. Thank you. Okay, so I always like to kind of set the stage, right? A little bit about how did we get here? And this kind of helps share some of the temperature stuff, right? I don't think anybody in this room you don't need to be told how warm it is this year, but when you really start to think about how does this sit across our state? So this is the statewide temperature regime dating all the way back to 1896, right? And really, if you look at the last 2 decades, give or take, maybe the last 25 years on the far right-hand side, you can see that we haven't been below the 100-year average pretty much in 25 years, okay? If we zoom in a little bit more, right? Yes, there's some ups and downs. You see where we sit today, right? Of course, maybe the warmest on record ever. But again, there's time, right? We've got time to kind of bring that back down a little bit. But nonetheless, setting the stage for tree defenses, this is important, right? It's really tough to be a tree in Colorado when it's so warm. And I'll talk about why that matters here as we kind of keep going. Let's turn a little bit to snowpack, right? We've talked about it's warm, and of course, when it's warm, trees are transpiring longer, right? So what does that mean, right? So think back to 5th grade, right? Trees have to open up their stomates to exchange gases. When they do that, they're losing more water, okay? We're doing that for longer periods now because it's warmer longer, and certainly warmer than it has been in the last couple of, the last 2 decades, warmer than it has been in the last 100 years. So let's look at the snowpack. This starts in 2019. If you remember, 2019 was a really wet year, as you can see, 100 plus across the board in all of our major drainages in Colorado. If we go forward to 2020, right, everybody wants to forget about the pandemic here, right? We were all locked up inside, but it's kind of the tale of 2 states. The northern half of the state from about I-70 north, looking pretty good. The southern half looking pretty crappy. By 2021, you can still kind of see the southern half never really recovers. By 2022, even worse yet. And arguably, right, we're sitting only at about, thinking about where we sit, right, 89, somewhere around 70 to 80% on average for each of these years. Recall back 2 years ago, right, 2023, pretty good year, had pretty decent, a lot of storms came late in the season, which bumped all these totals up. We kind of have these 3 peaks of large storms that rolled in April and May. And then when we start to go forward, 2024, back to that half the state looking crappy, half the state on average, or slightly below average. Okay, then here we sit 2025. This was in May last year. Again, really bad southern half, maybe only 3/4 of what we should have had sitting in that kind of, upper where we sit, in that kind of South Platte drainage areas. And then again, in February of 2026 is when everybody was kind of like, man, this is shaping up to be a pretty bad year. Here's where we sit today. Right? Looking pretty rough, right? 13% in the Arkansas drainage, 14% down. I mean, you can look at them, right? I don't need to read them off, but nobody above 44%, which is amazing, right? For this time of year. Let's look at the graph, okay? If you just don't want to look at it based on snow water equivalency, looking at the drainages, let's look statewide. I don't know if you can see this, but there's a little tiny green star or asterisk or something right here. That's the average of where we would hope to be. The black line is currently where we are, right? On April 1, we were at 3.3. This last little bit, dropped us. We have this tiny little check mark right here. Today we sit at 4 inches. Right? When the average is truly somewhere around 16 or 17. So again, pretty significant record levels, right? We've never seen anything like this, certainly well below where even our lowest recorded has ever been. What about across our whole nation, right? So are we the only ones? No, we're all screwed, right? Look at this. I mean, when you think about, this isn't just bark beetles in Colorado, this is bark beetles in Wyoming, New Mexico, Arizona, all of the western states, all the way out to California. So that was snowpack. Let's look at the overall precipitation, right? And why does this matter? I'll talk about this here in a little bit, but you can see we're still in that kind of oscillating back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And maybe there's been a couple of years in the last couple of decades that are well above, but as I've already mentioned, right? But here we sit, right? 2019 and 2023 were really good years. All the rest of them were pretty much, not sitting so great or right about at average. So those El Nino, all of those monsoonal flow that happens in July and August, all that does is keep trees from losing less, right? We mostly get the bulk of our water from all of our snowpack that occurs throughout the winter months. Again, if we zoom in, I sometimes put fire years on here. I didn't this time, but you can imagine, right? These years, of course, where we have extreme below average precipitation, those are the biggies, right? Think back on all of the major fires that have occurred. They've all been in conjunction with these very low precipitation events. And the fire people here can tell you that. So that'll matter here in just a little bit. I'll talk about why all that, we care about all that. But let's talk about some biology for mountain pine beetle. Mountain pine beetle is part of the Dendroctonus genus, right? So again, all of those bark beetles, there's over 600 species of bark beetles in North America. Mountain pine beetle is just one of them. Its, species name is ponderosae, and that's important because it was first described attacking ponderosa pine, but all pine trees except for pinyon are susceptible in Colorado. And I'll go into that here in a minute. Every year they've got to fly to a new green tree. There's one generation per year. And that's important because what we see out on the landscape today, red trees or dead trees, right? Those beetles are emerging from those trees to find a new green tree every single year. And again, that happens in July and August. And typically, they will produce pitch tubes. So that's important. What the hell is a pitch tube, right? That are these resin globs, popcorn-like resin globs on the outside of the bark. And that's formed from a bark beetle that is going down inside that bark, okay? They've got to get through that outer layer of bark in that fine layer that lives in between the outer bark and the wood proper, the xylem. Okay, that's where bark beetles live. If I'm a tree, I'm protecting myself with resin ducts. Every year, I'm putting on growth, right? Both taller and wider, right? And I want to protect those annual growth rings by these resin ducts. You can think of them like a whole bunch of garden hoses that are filled up with resin. And if something should try to get through that outer bark, they've got to go through those garden hoses full of resin to get down inside. That's the tree's defense to be able to push these beetles out should they start to get down inside that bark. Okay. Once they get down inside, I don't know how well this comes across, they lay eggs. And then of course, somebody brought a picture of a Highland opsa. All Dendroctonus have this half moon shape to them. So if you're out there, everybody thinks they're an entomologist, right? Looking at a beetle and they're like, this is it, this is the one. You got to kind of look for that half moon shape of the body, but nonetheless, really, once they get down inside, they lay their eggs. 10 days later, those eggs hatch. The larvae then start to feed around the bowl, so perpendicular to the stem, and eventually those larvae girdle that tree. Okay, go back to 5th grade biology, right? Trees are producing this photosynthate sugars that are then moving down to the roots. As these bark beetles are feeding, they're severing all of that movement of sugar down to the roots, and then that tree eventually turns red. Okay, that's why we see it dead.
So I was told it was a virus, but it's not the virus.
If you ask a pathologist, they'll probably tell you that, but there are no viruses that are associated with bark beetles. They're moving fungi around and yeasts and some bacteria, don't get me wrong. But that blue staining wood does nothing structurally. The blue staining that goes into the wood does nothing structurally. It can plug up some of the waterways, but by and large, it's the severing of that phloem layer keeping all that food source from going back down to the roots, it starves itself. Yeah,
This is all within 1 year. When do they lay egg and then which month are they doing?
yep, we'll get there. Yep. So if you pull off the bark, sorry, I can repeat questions for people online or whatever. The question was, when is all this happening? And we'll get there. Under the bark, C-shaped grubs almost always means bark beetles. Okay, tiny little C-shaped grubs about the size of rice under the bark. They produce these pupal chambers, not super important, but about the end of May, maybe mid-May, you'll start to see these chambers created that are big enough for them to, you know, kind of writhe around in and complete their development from larva to pupae. Okay, and then of course there's blue stain associated with them. I didn't go into too much detail on this one, but of course they're carrying around these spores in specialized structures that are called micandria. And that basically breaks down the sugars within the tree and makes it available for their larvae. Okay. Again, I've already mentioned all pine species are susceptible in Colorado. What we're most concerned with are these top two, right? Lodgepole and ponderosa pine. There is an outbreak in limber pine that's south of here in the mosquito range, which I think I showed. To the gentleman's question about when is all this happening? We have been trapping, and I guess I pulled data from 2025 just last year, but nonetheless, you can see some blue stars that I've depicted on this map. We're trapping statewide. We just happen to pull stuff from range specific to mountain pine beetle, so that we can talk about when are the adults out and seeking new trees, and so that every year we have fresh data that, of course, we're compiling to add to the data set. I don't know how well this comes across. The top figure shows us mountain pine beetle and ponderosa pine at those few sites that had blue stars. We're pretty much talking about, yes, we collect a few beetles, 1 to 10 beetles early on in July, right? The last week of June, this is June 29th, where we got a couple of beetles, and then this is July 13th. The bulk of where we're picking it up is pretty much the last week of July, first week of August into, you know, depending upon location, pretty much through August is when we can expect adults to be out flying.
This year,
Great question. Everybody wants to know, are we earlier? The short of the answer is no. We've been pulling bark weekly and measuring head capsules on larvae to see if we're any different than in any other year. It appears as though no, not yet. That all could change in the next 2 months, but it looks as though we're right on track. And this holds for lodgepole over in Gunnison. This holds for ponderosa pine down in the southwest corner as well. They all seem to be tracking like they would normally, which makes sense biologically, right? They all want to sync up, so they're all emerging at the same time so they can find mates and overcome tree defenses. So it all kind of makes sense. Lodgepole pine, I just threw it up here only because some of us live in that ecotone where there's that mix of lodgepole, ponderosa pine, or maybe we live in Gilpin County where it's all lodgepole pine, but yeah, it's slightly earlier in lodgepole, but not by a lot. We're pretty much talking that last week in July is this peak right here, and maybe it starts to end. This is August 24th right here at this very end. So again, maybe slightly earlier by a week if they're coming out of lodgepole, but pretty much by the end of July, the last week of July through August is the window for both pine species. I always want to talk about stand susceptibility a little bit for the more technical people in the audience that are like, hey, I'm having a contractor come out, or I'm thinking about long-term, what do I do and how do I cut my stand or my property or my whatever to get it into kind of, you know, out of these high susceptible categories. If we're talking lodgepole pine dominated stands, we're talking about diameters, average diameters across all the trees that are greater than 8 inches in diameter. When you start to approach that number, that means that you're starting to get into these higher susceptibility categories for being attacked by mountain pine beetle. Okay. Of course, that correlates to age. That's not super important, but again, densities that are sitting somewhere between 300 and 600 trees per acre. That's a pretty wide range. And so that's pretty much all of our lodgepole pine that has been not managed over the last few years. Okay. How about basal area? This is a metric of volume. So again, you can have a whole bunch of small diameter trees and still reach a high volume. You can have fewer trees, but much larger, and you can still reach this volume. Pretty much the threshold is about 130 square feet of basal area logical. Okay. Once you surpass that, you know it's time to start to do something. What about ponderosa pine is what we're mostly thinking about here and along the Front Range these days. When your stand diameters get larger than 6 inches, basal areas larger than about 75 to 120, that's a wide range, but pretty much 75, if you look at all the literature getting all the way back to the 50s, that encompasses all of that data as well. So pretty long record, more than 60 years worth of data on that. And again, thinking about spacing in trees per acre, you can reference John Schmidt's and Steve Motta's paper, but nonetheless, they talk about using both a function of spacing and quadratic mean diameter, or that kind of average large diameter tree of 6 inches. But again, 80 square feet of basal area per acre. Again, 6 inches or greater, high proportion of ponderosa pine. And when you start to get more than 3 trees per acre, according to Steve Munson and John Anhold, it gets you in these high susceptible categories. So again, just 2 papers, but really kind of showing that really those are the thresholds that you're looking for. When you start to measure all of your trees and you get average diameters greater than 6 inches, that pretty much is going to throw you into that category of high susceptible.
But you said 3 ponderosa per acre.
That are infested in any one year. Yep. Okay, let's talk about how we got here, right? Some of us with gray hair have been in Colorado long enough to know or remember, right, this outbreak in mountain pine beetle that occurred across the whole state, dating all the way back from about the late 1990s through about, the early teens. And this is kind of just the histogram that shows, from those of us sitting in aircraft, heck, Meg used to sit in an aircraft, part of this is her data too. But nonetheless, people sitting in aircraft, flying 1,000 feet off the forest floor, marking on a tablet, okay, there's something going on in the landscape, and then we jump into trucks and try to, ground truth as much as we possibly can. Remember, back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, right, most of this was in high elevation lodgepole pine dominated stands. Most of this was on national forest land, public land, where there is this kind of contiguous lodgepole pine forest. Very different than what we're seeing in this outbreak today. Again, we saw about 82% of the pine forests were affected from 96 through 2013. We've got about 4.2 million forested acres of pine in Colorado. 3.4 of that was affected during this outbreak. That doesn't mean that every tree on every acre was affected, right? This is just somebody looking out the window and drawing a polygon on the earth that says there's a clump of trees over here and over here. So over time, that starts to add up. I'm just going to show what that looks like across our landscape, right? This is the state of Colorado. Looks like somebody might, you got it? Okay. This is 1996. So this is just for the right brain visual learners that are in the audience, right? Looking at that histogram, what does it look like on the earth? I'll just let this kind of run. This is an automated thing, but 90, you can see at the top, 98, 99, really 2000 is coming up here. And so we're just going year after year, 2001, 2. And this is where we really start to see some activity, 2003, 2004, 05. And this is the concern, right? Is that mountain pine beetle starts to move like a wave across the landscape. When beetle populations get super large, they're really moving wave-like, irregardless of tree defenses. This is 2011, pretty much have been through most of North Park 2012, right? Remember, does anybody remember what happened on the Front Range in 2013? Right. 100-year flood, or what did they call it, a biblical flood, or whatever they called it in the media, right? And so that pretty much stopped this thing in its tracks because trees were able to start to defend themselves. And so we'll click out of that. You can kind of see at the histogram, right? There's nothing going on for about a decade. We were sitting here with not a lot of mountain pine beetle activity. If you look at the inset, this starts at 2020. I don't know how well you guys can see this, but 2020, 21, 22, 23, 24, and 25, okay? you can start to see, right, nobody cared about 200 acres in 2020, right? We all want to forget the pandemic year. And then we were just gradually kind of ticking along until about 2023. And that's when we really started to see this exponential growth curve starting to build. And that's where we sit today, right? We're starting to see this ramp up that's just starting to get off the charts. And that's when we start to get worried. Across our state, I'm zooming in here a little bit to the state, and I'm also starting to talk about forest types on here now. The gray is where mountain pine beetle has already been. The dark green is ponderosa pine forests, and the lighter green is lodgepole pine forests. You can see that we've got really, this starts in 2019, we've really got 3 outbreaks of mountain pine beetle building in 3 different forest types. The stuff down in the Black Forest that we started along the Front Range in the Black Forest in El Paso County is in ponderosa pine. We see the mosquito range building up in limber pine, and then we see lodgepole pine in Taylor Park, just in Gunnison County. If we move forward a little bit in time, here we are in 2020. This correlates exactly with that mini histogram that we just saw, right? Nobody's excited about 200 acres. You got to squint and turn your head to see anything on there, right? By 2021, we start to see a little more. By 2022, we start to see yet a little more, just in that kind of Jefferson County, of course, where we sit in Gilpin in Boulder County. And then, of course, these are building up even more so. By 2023, that's the figure that we've all seen, right? The histogram figure. Taylor Park goes crazy. We cut that all over. The stuff in the mosquito range is still continuing. And then, of course, the stuff along the Front Range building. Remember, 2023 was that wet snowpack year. And so we kind of thought that maybe this would start to die back. But that clearly didn't happen with the dry drought conditions that we saw in 2024 and then yet again in 2025. So here we are in 2024, building even more so. Here we are in 2025. I don't think I did. Okay, so for the first time in recent history, at least, the aerial survey data dates all the way back into the 1950s. We have a really great contiguous record in the 1980s of paper maps. We transitioned over to digital record in 1996. For the first time in 2025, because of the federal administration and the conundrums with funding our federal agencies, we did not fly most of the central part of Colorado. We certainly did not fly most of, the West Alps, and all of the San Bernardino Cristo and Calibre range was not flown. So we don't really know what's going on there. And maybe that's not a problem in one year, right? We can lean back on a year's data, but it becomes problematic when year after year we don't have data in a location, we don't know what's coming. Let's zoom in a little bit now so that maybe you get a little more clarity on kind of where we're sitting today, right? Boulder here, Longmont here, Denver here, Jefferson County, of course, Gilpin County, and then, moving down through Teller and into Douglas County. Let's bring it back to reality, right? So this is what it looks like. I flew a drone over an area in September, and this is just outside of El Rancho. On the left here, this is I-70. I don't know how well this comes across, but this is drainage, complete drainage mortality. If we then say this is somebody's home right here, right? And so this is just outside of Evergreen. This is a mega $1 million home right here. And of course, you can see what happened to the property values, not to mention what's happening to their fire risk, right? So that's why this is becoming an ever increasing problem. Again, I-70 running through the central part of the screen, more activity here. I don't know how well this comes across, but we're starting to get this coalescing of hundreds of trees that are starting to become impacted. And that's where there's kind of no point of return, right? You can't come back from this. And so we can go in and harvest some of this, of course, and reduce some of the fire risk, but replanting and things are very, very difficult in these dry conditions. And so this is important because of all the utilities that are around Evergreen, as well as all of the egress concerns in subdivisions like this. Not to mention, of course, the WUI, right? The wildland urban interface where all these people live. I don't know how well this comes across. There's a home up here, there's another home up here, there's another home right here. Across the entire top of that ridge, there's one mega mansion after the other. And that's a problem, right? Because this is the box canyon that is now starting to become tinder dry. And we're changing the fuel arrangement from needles and 1 hour fuels or 10-hour fuels being up in the trees to now raining down onto the forest floor. Needles and small twigs are now a part of that surface fuel component, which means that should a fire come through, we can see and expect fire behavior to become that much more extreme. If you look on this hillside, I hiked my butt up and down this really steep hillside, just so that we could get a feel for how many of these green trees are currently infested. For every red tree that you see on this screen, there's somewhere between 2.5 and 10 green infested trees that will turn red this upcoming summer. This will become an ever-present problem on all of our traffic corridors. The footprint will, of course, get larger, and the intensity is about to increase because the brood production this year is very high. I'm not here to doom and gloom, just trying to tell you that this will increase undoubtedly. Again, here we sit, right? So this is kind of the northern half of Colorado. We're, right up in here. Again, I just kind of want to point out, right? This is 9 counties that are currently affected by mountain pine beetle outbreak. There are papers out there that describe mountain pine beetle can fly up to 1 kilometer, or on average 1 kilometer every single year. That's about a half mile. That's a long distance, but we can start to take some of those distances and apply it to where we know mountain pine beetle currently is from somebody sitting in an aircraft and saying there's a problem here, here, and here. I've done that for you here, and this is what that whole thing looks like. We start to see the entirety of the Front Range be in a risk category, right? There's another paper that describes, that 1 kilometer is hogwash. It's actually more like 2.5 kilometers.
This is taking 25 data and roll it.
It is, yep. So this is 2025 aerial survey data, and then saying, let's just apply a 1 kilometer buffer around that and look to see what that looks like. That's this. So a half mile from where we know it is.
Is that in column air?
I'm sorry?
Is that in column air?
That, good question. No, this is just reality of marking and recapturing insects.
So back in the late 70s, early 80s, when we had infestation then,
Yep,
we were probably talking lodgepole then.
we were,
It was heaviest on the west side of the divide at that time.
Yep.
And really encroached on us on this side so bad. And coming to a meeting like this, those just sitting out here in these seats were informed that the beetle, because of when we had that half mile or kilometer, was not gonna travel over the Continental Divide.
oh yeah, that was fun.
And those are just like, and now that all you gotta do if you're a butterfly or a hummingbird or a beetle is to jump up in the air and you're in Kansas, Kansas.
That's right. So
Dan, sorry, can you just repeat the
I'm sorry, for the folks on the audience, online, the question was, is that 1 kilometer in calm air? And it was actually done in a forest ecosystem setting in Wyoming, so, through the Snowy Range. And this was done in the early teens, 20 teens. John Withrow published this paper with Jose Negron, I believe in 2012. So that gives you an idea. And so you're not wrong that yes, they can, as they build populations, they're getting up into that wind column and being dispersed. During that event, we saw beetles that were all the way out in Sydney, Nebraska. So we know that they can certainly get airborne and then take off. But remember, those are winds that need to occur in July and August. Which we do get Chinook winds and we do get large wind events. Certainly, as we've seen over the last couple of months, wind is becoming more and more important. Let's look at this if we say, okay, well, maybe this is all bunk, right? It can certainly go farther than that. There's a paper that describes that's not true. Most Dendroctonus will fly within 1.5 miles. And so let's do that exercise and look to see, well, what does that look like, right? That's this map. That means that none of us are immune from mountain pine beetle showing up in any one year, okay? And don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that every tree on every acre is going to get affected in 1 year. This is just how far are we likely to see activity and where should we focus and prioritize our efforts? And this tells me that all 800,000 acres up and down the Front Range is pretty much at risk right now. Okay. Our friends over at the US Forest Service, they produced a similar map, just describing, okay, well, what might that look like? They put a rate of spread on it, which is over here, so they're showing every year it's gonna, expand by a kilometer. This is the doom and gloom map, right? This is everything. This is Doug fir beetle and spruce beetle and mountain pine beetle and every beetle that we know. But again, I think they're trying to show that, hey, everything is pretty much at risk. Okay, let's zoom into where we sit today, right? I don't know how well this comes across, but again, this is Boulder County sitting right here. This is Gilpin County just south of us, of course, and this is Jefferson County down here and Clear Creek. But you can kind of see, right, that we've got a big pocket of activity just up Left Cane Canyon, right? So again, you can figure out where you sit next to that, and certainly through Gold Hill and some other locations, we know that there's activity. And try to figure out, well, how likely am I to get it based on this? If we then say, okay, well, where has mountain pine beetle already been in the late 1990s and early 2000s? That's this gray. And then we can start to say, well, maybe the largest diameter trees were affected during that outbreak. And so what does it leave us, right? It leaves us about 500,000 acres up and down the Front Range, which is a whole lot of wood. And so I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball to know, is it really gonna affect all of this, right? But we can certainly start to surmise that, again, applying that 1.5 mile buffer, that's pretty much darn near everything up and down the Front Range, save for a little pocket just north of Boulder. So again, not to fear monger, just to say, here's an exercise to try to figure out, where should we be focusing our efforts? And it's pretty much all of us in this room. That's why there's so many people that have turned out. I'm going to talk quickly through this section only because I think that this is pretty inherent to everybody in this room. If you don't know, there's a forest census that is done every year. There's a series of plots that are out there that are done by the Forest Inventory and Analysis Group. This is just showing plots from 2020 through 2024 across our state. But there's plots that are revisited every 10 years. This gives us an idea of what's happening out on the landscape and gives us an idea of stand mensuration data, right? Densities, diameters, how much is out there of each species, on and on, okay? I decided, well, let's look at the 9 counties up and down the Front Range that are currently affected by mountain pine beetle. And let's look and see, well, how much of that is ponderosa pine? And then of that, how much of that is in large diameters, okay, that is susceptible to bark beetles. So here's the figure on that, right? By county, you can start to see that if your Boulder County at about 1/3 of your entire forest is ponderosa pine, Jefferson County sits the same, El Paso, Douglas, maybe 1/4, Larimer, maybe 1/4, maybe Teller 1/4. Again, many of these are all large components of ponderosa pine, okay? Then let's start to look, I'm sorry for the Easter egg colors, a gal in my office thought this would be cute, but nonetheless, county by county, you can start to see, okay, well, of those plots that are sitting in ponderosa pine dominated, how much of it is ponderosa pine? Is it a half or is it a whole bunch more of that? That's what this is showing you, that here we sit right in Boulder County, by far ponderosa pine. How about in Boulder County, wherever they're at? Oh, this is Boulder here, where's Gilpin right here, maybe half of it is in Pondo. So again, starting to kind of paint the picture that, yep, there's truly a lot of ponderosa pine that's out there. And then let's look at the diameter classes. We've got all the small trees up above, 0 to 6 inches, and then everything else, larger diameter trees that we can start to say, okay, well, how much of it is sitting in these large diameter classes that are out there? We don't care about the small diameter trees because mountain pine beetle doesn't attack those by and large. They can, but no self-respecting female bark beetle is going to lay her eggs in a 3-inch diameter tree. There's just no food for her babies. So they go for the larger diameter trees, okay? So we can say, yep, sure enough, for some of these counties that are sitting out there, maybe Jefferson County, look at this, they're screwed, right? Think about Boulder County, think about, Gilpin County maybe doing a little bit better. None that are in these 18-inch plus diameter categories, but still a lot of large diameter trees that are out there. And so that tells me that, yep, we're starting to project some of this, and I didn't put it in here, it's too lengthy for this talk, but we're now starting to say if 1%, 5%, 30%, 40% of our ponderosa pine is affected, how much volume is about to come off, and how much of our mill capacity do we have? And that's all focused around the governor's task force. But just know that that data is out there, and we can help you with some of that, but let's lump them all together, right? All 9 counties, what does it look like? We've roughly got about 46% is in susceptible diameter. All the rest of that is in susceptible diameter categories. So for every tree that you see out there, and you can see I've got the trees per acre out there, we're sitting somewhere around, 70 plus trees per acre that are all in large diameter categories. That's a lot of wood. How about, let's talk management, right? Because I don't want to talk for too terribly long. Where are you? Okay. I was sitting around my office one day and a gal in my office was like, what are all these 35mm slides doing here? Can I throw them out? And I was like, she's like in her teens, right? And I was like, okay, let's look at them and see what they are. 50 plus years ago, this is a slide that was produced about mountain pine beetle management strategies. Okay? Direct control. These are all very much still in line with what we do today. For direct control, meaning what do we do if a tree has beetles in it, right? You can use chemicals, that hasn't changed much. But mechanical is where it's all at, right? What are we gonna do with that? We can burn it, we don't do that much anymore, but we can. We can use solar treatments, we do that sometimes. We sometimes chip it, we sometimes peel it, and we sometimes get it to the mill. None of that has changed. That's still direct control strategies, which I'll get into here in a second. Maybe arguably we don't bury things anymore, and maybe arguably we don't float things in water anymore. But it's still get it off the landscape to a safe location is pretty much still what we're doing today. Okay. How about indirect preventive measures? Silviculture techniques that help us add resiliency, add some kind of ability to withstand this disturbance, right? Thinning, patch cuts, vigor enhancements, species conversions and regen, that's all still on the table. Those are all tools that we use at the State Forest Service to help people get a better trajectory for their landscape, okay? And of course, this chemical side, which I'll go into in just a little bit of detail. How about the timing of when we should be doing what we're doing? Again, this is 50 plus years ago, right? 52, 53 years ago. Almost 53 to the date. At any rate, right, as soon as possible, we want to identify the problem. Well, we're all here, we're identifying the problem. How about in September through January? We want to survey to determine the extent of the infestation. That hasn't changed, we still do that to this day. September through January, organize everybody, all the landowners that are within the area of infestation. We're still doing that by HOA, POA, community level, trying to hold events to talk about, okay, come September, October, November, here is the activity. How about January through April? I'd kind of like to move this up to September to January, but locate and mark all newly infested trees. Again, still doing it, right? After the beetles have flown, we want to mark those trees so that we can get them off the landscape so that the reservoir of beetles that are coming out of those trees is much, much lower. And then, of course, how about, April through May, cut down and delimb and get all those trees that are infested off the landscape. We might want to shift that closer to the fall time, but it's still a viable option. And then how about before August? Destroy any beetles in infested logs. Again, the way that we do that is mastication and chipping. We don't use suitable chemicals for the most part anymore. That was back when PDB and all the things people were spraying, all kinds of stuff onto trees. We've learned that those are carcinogens and we don't do that anymore. But by and large, again, the direct control options are still very much the same, save for we are now using beetle communication against bark beetles. We are hanging traps in trees, getting bark beetles to go into these traps, and then taking them off the landscape. There needs to be some thought around this. If we're putting a lure onto this trap to say beetles come here, that means that you're bringing beetles into the area. So there's gotta be, this needs to be hung, as you can tell in this image, in areas of dead trees, in meadows, in areas where beetles are not gonna go like aspens, right? We wanna use the bark beetle biology against them. But again, peeling, using flail debarkers and using debarkers, still an option. Maybe we don't burn as much anymore, but we certainly chip wood, right? And get it off the landscape. I will here, I'm getting there, right here. Well, not right here, but right after this. let's talk about preventive sprays, right? So again, these are chemical nerve toxins that we're putting on the outside of trees to prevent bark beetles from going down inside. Okay, most of what people are spraying fall within carbaryl, permethrin, or bifenthrin, thinking about the active ingredients. Not all, but most. Okay, a lot of people are shifting away from carbaryl because it plugs up sprayers, but all of these need to be applied annually, every single year, because they break down in UV light.
When should you apply the spray?
The question was, when should you apply the spray? Pre-flight, as you can see on application timing, is the window. Pretty much right now is the window. And we want to make sure that we're getting it, of course, to the point of run. So it needs to be running down the bark. And they need to apply, whoever the applicator is, needs to apply it to a 3-inch diameter. So that means having enough head pressure in your pump to get it all the way to the top of the tree up to a 3-inch diameter. Okay. And then remember, all of the overspray that's coming off of that, these are nerve toxins, right? These are cholinesterase inhibitors, right? And we all have nerves, right? And for those of us that are, understand how nerves work, cholinesterase is what cleans those nerves out so that they stop firing. So again, think about that when we're thinking about, do I want to spray this? And do I have a well? All of this is water soluble. So again, there's no judgment if you're like, I'm going to spray my favorite trees on my drive going into my property and around my home envelope. I don't fault anybody for that by any means. That's the appropriate use of sprays. But saying I'm going to spray my 5 acres every tree is not an appropriate use of nerve toxins, in my opinion.
Further question, you said spraying right now until when?
So remember the graph. Bark beetles are emerging pretty much the last week in June. They start. This year, maybe I might hedge my bet and say the middle part of June. And so I would make sure that my trees are all covered by the end of May. And this is an annual treatment, again, needs to be done annually, and of course has to be done prior to any beetle flight. How about injections, right? Everybody always asks me.
Does that chemical wash off?
It does. Most people will put a surfactant on there, which is a cellulose product. And so once it dries onto the bark, usually that cellulose will dry up as well and keep it on the bark. It's a preventative. So it's so thick when they're spraying it, you'll see it, it's a white spray that kind of sticks on there. And once that's dried, then it impermeates that outer bark. Yep.
What is the toxicity of those chemicals? Where the studies have done on the toxicity of those chemicals?
Yep.
How long are they going to stay?
Yeah, so the question is toxicity. Each one of these, whether it's carbaryl, permethrin, or bifenthrin, they've all got different levels of toxicity and environmental concerns. As I put on here, right, most of this is all water soluble. You cannot spray this stuff if you're within 25 feet of water per the EPA. So you can go out and get the SDS sheet if you're thinking about having somebody spray Dragnet or Astro. You can go and look at the safety sheet and say, okay, what's my environmental concern on this particular product? And that's what I would encourage everybody to do.
About not environmental health concern of the residents.
Right, so there's LD50 that are all on each one of these that are done on mice. So again, a sprayer might tell you that it's certainly fine. I would go and pull the safety sheet on each product that they're gonna spray. Yeah, question about health concerns for humans. So again, these are nerve toxins, so yes.
So,
Yeah.
so is it worth saving that tree and having that nerve toxin around?
Maybe for you, no. Some people, are willing to take that risk to have the trees. And I think we've all got to kind of be cognizant, right? Of grandkids, pets, all the things that are using our property versus somebody who's like, I just want to have my trees green as I go up there once a year, or if it's a second home or whatever it might be. Yep. Somebody else had a question, yeah.
How long is it toxic for the other animals or insects? Birds that live in that tree that you spray?
The question is, how long is it toxic considering wildlife and other concerns? The chemical companies will tell you that it's no longer a risk when it's dry. However, if you go and look at the scientific literature, it shows that they are water soluble and they are moving down through the soil column. So again, it's acute toxicity and how much is being put out there is the question. And typically, remember, these have to be applied to the point of run. So there's a lot of literature that's out there about, is this deleterious to wells and all of that? And so you've got to do some of your own research. I just say, maybe understand that there's a reason that the EPA says this cannot be applied within 20 feet of water. And of course, all of the fish, frogs, and everything else, right, are at risk if you do that.
What about bird life? Birds are maybe
Yep, so the question is about bird life, and I'll just kind of lean back on that epidemic that occurred in the late 1990s, early 2000s. From the use of carbaryl spray in Grand Valley and throughout Grand County and other locations that really had a lot of mountain pine beetle and lodgepole pine, there was spraying of carbaryl year after year after year. And what ultimately ended up happening is that those trees still many of those trees were still succumbing to activity, but not from bark beetles. We'd killed off all of the beneficial insects and all of the birds that are feeding all of those scale insects and everything else. And then we started to see the scale insects become resistant to a lot of this and build up their populations to the point that they started to kill trees. So there's an ugly side of too much spray, right? And the ecological impacts on that. Question.
There are some agricultural products that are designed to help plants with increased water retention.
There are.
And you know, they're getting greater crop yields with less water. And I have a friend who wanted me to ask this question. Are you aware of any application of those products on our trees to increase their water retention?
Yes, there's a lot of contemporary research that is looking into sea kelp and other minerals to help improve overall tree vigor. And the short of the story is, for wood borers and bark beetles, it just makes those trees that much more attractive. So we don't fertilize our trees when we're in the middle of this, because that phloem layer gets thicker and the nutrition value gets greater. Yep. How about injectables? This has come up recently because there's a lot of contractors that are out there, maybe some in this room or online, that will say, no, I want to inject trees. The only one that I really recommend is emamectin benzoate. That's the only one that there's data out there. There's other ones like azadirachtin and other compounds that are out there that there isn't much data on. And again, I'm specifically talking about in conifers. You might hear about emamectin or EB for use of emerald ash borer and ash trees down in town, right? That's a whole different ballgame when you're applying these things into a deciduous tree that have a lot of translaminar movement of product. Conifers don't have that. When you inject a tree with EB, you got about a 2-inch window from where you inject it into the port and it's drawing it up that tree. You just don't get around or kind of perpendicular to the bole movement. And so you have to put a lot of wells into the base of those trees to get proper treatment. The other piece of it, you know, again, thinking about the environmental concerns, whoever asked that question, this is much more environmentally conscientious because you're injecting it into the tree, right? Not really thinking about the birds and the scale insects and everything else that are out there, but you know, you're not having that runoff and the overspray. It's contained within that tree. However, we got to think about, of course, the effectiveness in our lodgepole and ponderosa pine. And there isn't a whole lot. In fact, there is not any data that describes ponderosa pine and lodgepole with mountain pine beetle and EB. Okay? There are with analogous systems, thinking about western pine beetle and some Ips beetles. And Don Grossman, if he were here from ArborJet, would tell you it'll work. And maybe it does, but some of our trials that we've done over in Eagle County and in Vail have shown that you have to put so many wells at the base that it's a real challenge. And in a year like this, I should have put this in huge bold. Expect water stress trees to not translocate EB. And this is the year, right, where trees are just dry as can be, there's no movement of water going up. And so if you notice, there's some popular videos that are out there right now about tree care companies that are trying to inject trees. They're trying to pump that stuff down inside the tree. What the applicators now are doing are making deeper wells into the xylem of the tree, thank you, so that they can inject that stuff into the well. It shouldn't be done that way. It really should, the tree should be drawing that product up right at that phloem layer. So to get away from it, they're kind of doing these unscrupulous activities where they're drilling further down into the tree just to get the product in there. And you'll notice that they're using pumps. They're pumping that stuff into the tree because the tree is not treating that like it should be.
Will watering our trees now be helpful?
Absolutely, yes. Now is the window. We know that conifers draw up most of their water, over 70% of their water is drawn up March, April, and May. So now is the window, right? Get yourself some buckets with holes in them. There's all kinds of devices that are sold through the marketplace, right? That have little pinholes that slowly water trees. We've done a lot of this over in Gilpin County, or in Vrain County, looking to see the effectiveness of that kind of little bit of watering, and it goes a long way. And thinking about some of the research that was done at CSU, right? Thinking about bark beetles and drought stress and how do trees respond to drought stress. So we know that that's one tool.
You don't recommend doing the injection?
I don't, maybe if Mother Nature turns on some water and we start to get more water, we can see some translocation of that product within the tree, but this isn't the year for injectables, in my opinion.
Okay.
How about semiochemicals? Somebody early on asked about verbenum, so let's get to this because we're running short on time. What are semiochemicals, right? This is just a fancy term for using pheromones, both aggregation and anti-aggregation. We use them in traps to bring them, or we draw beetles into an area that we know we're gonna come in and do some harvesting in. We cut those trees, get them out and get them to the mill so that we're hauling as many beetles out as we possibly can, okay? That's bringing beetles in. But what most of us wanna do is repel beetles, right? Keep them away. So we're gonna use some of these other compounds that were designed for Doug fir beetle and spruce beetle, but really we're looking at the one for mountain pine beetle, which is verbenum. Okay. I produced a, well, I shouldn't say we have produced a fact sheet at the State Forest Service. It's really more of a frequently asked questions document. As questions kept coming in, I was like, just add it to the list and we'll just start explaining all this. You can find that out on the Colorado State Forest Service website. It's filled with all kinds of stuff. I put some diagrams in there to show people how you might apply bubbles in packets so that you can get an idea of, oh, this might be how I do it across my property. The effectiveness on this, again, is only 15 feet. So the efficacy is basically a tree by tree basis. So difficult to do acreage, right? It becomes a problem. There's several products that are sold. I'm not here, I work for the government, right? I don't have a dog in the fight any way you do it. But I can just tell you that products that are made, I think I can say this. Products that have the name splat in them have been shown through the chemists to have verbenum drop out after 21 days. So that means that product is great if you wait until July and you want to get through July. That's it. Products that are sold not with the name splat on them are sold in a semi-permeable membrane. Verbenone and other compounds emit out of this bubble and or packet at a rate per day that mimics the rate that bark beetles are saying, hey, there's no vacancy in this tree, you gotta go somewhere else. Okay? I'll leave it at that. The timing is similar. There was a question up front that was about when do you spray? Same thing for packets. You staple them on trees in June to give you, that's a 90-day product, so you only got 90 days for this thing to work. I'm getting reports of people stapling into trees right now. That's bunk. It's not gonna work, right? You've only got April, May, and June. You're gonna have spent everything in that product by the time the adults are coming out. So you gotta wait and think about these graphs. This is the whole reason why we've been developing these histograms to show when mountain pine beetle is emerging so that we can time up our management options with it.
Now, does that timing also apply to the Douglas fir, the MCH?
It does, and if you notice on the State Forest Service website, I've got some Doug fir and MCH specific data as well to help people, but basically, the gist on Doug fir, with all the traps that I've got across the state, so thinking Pickens County, Gunnison County, Chaffee County, Lake County, it's pretty much the beginning of June. You gotta have your product out there mid-May for MCH and Doug fir meal.
Okay, so mid-May to 1st of June is really what you're.
They will start emerging at that window. Yeah. And if you email me, I'll send you some histograms to give you some data to support that. I've already mentioned, I'm short on time. You can go to the State Forest Service website. We're starting to house a whole bunch of information on treatments. You can start to click on things and kind of get some more specific information about each treatment that you might be considering. As well as, I don't know where people are coming from, but I'm trying to develop a tool for people to understand where can I take hot logs? Hot logs meaning logs that have bugs in them. There's a web map that's out there that you can just click on each one of these. The name comes up, all the restrictions that are associated with each one come up, and pricing and everything else. So go to the website, you can figure out what's my closest one to take it, how much might it cost me. But people in Gilpin County got it made, right? You got a free one right there in the middle.
How effective are the patches?
How effective? Good question. Once you get, well, the manufacturers will tell you, once you get over 15% infestation within your stand, the packets are no longer effective. What we found is we use about 8 to 10% infestation. When we start to see anywhere around 1 out of every 10 trees is infested, we then start to shift over to using chemical preventive sprays. So I hope that helps. It is not a silver bullet. It too, you can have losses. One area in the Black Forest in El Paso County, we applied 1,200 acres, and we lost 6 trees. So it doesn't mean that it's the silver bullet, but 6 trees out of 1,200 acres is pretty darn good. I think everybody in this room would say, if I lost, a few trees less than 1%, I could live with that.
Should I spray and use the patch?
It depends on the infestation in your area. So go to that map, go to the State Forest Service website, type in your address. There's a little home button, right? You can type in your address and you can look and see where somebody sitting in an aircraft saw something, and it then can trigger you to say, yeah, I'm pretty darn close. Maybe I should start to spray. But if you are not seeing,
We have seen some beetle killed trees.
yeah,
So,
if you're starting to see it, I would then start to lean towards the verbenone treatments, especially in this year. And then if I started to see an increase year after, I would switch over to start using some sprays for my high valued individual monumental trees.
Is there any health effect of verbenone?
There are no environmental effects. This is what is called a biorationale, or it's listed under the EPA as a bio tool. And so there's no health concerns and no environmental concerns.
It's a study effect.
Oh, yeah, you can find the data on that. I just kind of want to point out, the statewide response is starting to get some traction, right? So I went down in November, presented to Governor Polis about kind of the maps and what you guys have seen today. Polis then gathered together a whole bunch of team of people that met early on. We've already had 2 meetings, and we're starting to develop subcommittees to try to figure out, how do we tackle this mountain pine beetle problem in these 9 counties, offering up tools and perhaps financial resources in the future. In the past, those of us with gray hair that have been through the past outbreak, right? We know that task force developed tools and tax incentives to utilize the wood. And that's sunsetting in 2026. So that bill was put forth by Dan Gibbs. That's sunsetting in this year in 2026. And so the goal is to try to develop bills and initiatives that will help us with getting the wood off the landscape and treating our areas. I'll leave it at that. I don't think I need to belabor too much the task force. You can certainly Google Jared Polis and the Ponderosa Pine Beetle Task Force, as he called it. You can find information out there, but nonetheless, there's a statewide response with your elected officials having these conversations in real time every day.
Are all species of conifer equally susceptible to something?
Negative. So the question is, are all species negatively impacted? So remember, mountain pine beetle will really only affect pines. And of the pine species, they pretty much will prefer ponderosa pine before they go to lodgepole. And I did some graduate work on this too, looking at if beetles were born in lodgepole, will they prefer to go to lodgepole? The answer is no, they prefer to go to ponderosa. If they were born in ponderosa, will they transition back to lodgepole? They will, but they don't want to. They'll continue to go to ponderosa until that's been exhausted.
And yet, some of the past, kits that we had were contained solely in lodgepole.
Correct, that is right, and I believe that that's solely just like what's next door neighbor. They don't like to fly, they pretty much hate to fly more than a quarter mile. They can, obviously, but they don't. If they have susceptible trees right next door, they will just literally fly to the tree that's right next door.
But in the next forest, why would that still get?
It is, again, there's a population level that we've got to discuss here, but as endemic levels are flying through the forest, the females are the ones that are seeking all those trees. They're looking for the largest diameter trees mostly because, again, they're looking for that food source. So if they're coming out of a smallish diameter tree, they're likely to go to a larger diameter tree. Thinking proportion wise, they're more likely to go to a larger diameter tree than a small.
Why didn't they go from the lodgepole and infect ponderosa during those pretty much, only lodgepole infestation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an answer for that. When we looked at the ecotone where it was transitioning out of the lodgepole into the ponderosa pine, they pretty much, and again, we had this 100-year rain event, so we didn't get to continue that work. But historically, if they start in lodgepole, they pretty much stay in lodgepole because we've got these contiguous forests that are all of the susceptible diameter woods plants. It wasn't until this last outbreak that we started to see them merge out of the lodgepole into the ponderosa pine, and then of course the rain event. So not tested. Again, pretty small outbreaks historically, also thinking across the state, which I've mapped out dating all the way back to the 50s of any outbreak that was in any of the literature. And they're pretty small in nature up until this 1996.
What creatures, animals, birds like to eat these food?
Great question. I didn't mention this, but so the question was, what predates bark beetles and kind of what other creatures are out there that are killing bark beetles? There are, of course, the bird folks in the room will tell you that there's a suite of woodpeckers that, of course, woodpeckers are not pecking on trees just for fun, right? They're looking for a protein source under the bark. And that's all larvae. But there are also a suite of beetles that can affect bark beetles as well. But you should know that when we think about the population dynamics, we would never consider more than 5% of the population to decline from a biological event, meaning birds, beetles, all the things that eat and kill. Historically, bark beetles were kept in check through cold overwintering temperatures. We haven't seen temperatures cold enough to kill any larvae since 1985 in Colorado. And that happened in the Fraser Valley, where there was a building population. It got below -35 degrees under the bark temperature. And so that means it takes about 24 hours for ambient forest temperature to get under the bark where the larvae are living. That means it's got to be -35 for a day for it to then get under the bark. And contrary to what you might have heard, it's a one-time temperature. As soon as it gets to that -35, it's what's called a supercooling temperature, and it turns all of the liquid that's within their body to crystal, and they die immediately. It's not a prolonged period or anything like that. I've heard people say, oh, it needs to be a week or it needs to be days. That's not true. Maybe a day to get from ambient forest to underbark, but once it gets to that underbark, game over. Yeah. Question?
Is there anything, what is it about the pinyon pine that protects it? Is there any experiments to leverage off of whatever that biochemical is or whatever the difference is to give the immunity to other types of fungus?
Yep. So the question is, why is pinyon so, no longer vulnerable to mountain pine beetle? And that's because Each one of these bark beetle species has a suite of enzymes in their gut to process what are called monoterpenes. It's just like if you ever walk up to a ponderosa and it smells like butterscotch to you. Those are 20 carbon compound chains that are made for defenses. Bark beetles have to be able to break that down in order to create that pheromone plume to say, hey, everybody, this is the tree that we want to attack. It's kind of like a mountain pine beetle doesn't have the enzymes to break down a spruce. They don't have the enzymes to break down an aspen tree. And so, of course, this is through evolution. Pinyon has its own bark beetle that affects it that can break that down. And the question is, how can we promote trees that have more of the compounds that are deleterious to bark beetles? That work is being done. It's just like me and you, your defenses are different than mine. And so we have identified trees that have a phenology and some chemical component. We know that limonene is toxic to bark beetles. And so we want to find the individuals that have more limonene. And so we've done some of that work with caging cones and trying to grow those species, looking at the phenology and everything that's about that tree that makes it resistant. And so the trees that have evaded bark beetles in the last outbreak are the trees that we're hoping to go back to try to cage those cones and grow those in our state nursery. So it's a great question. That is ongoing work currently.
How effective is thinning and what density we need to aim for with that? We wanted to do, say, a fire mitigation project. What density should we be using?
Question is thinning and density and what do we aim for? And again, we got to go back to volume. So thinking about how big are the trees that are on the landscape, the residual trees after we come through, and then thinking about maybe our grandparents set us up to be in this scenario, right? We kept coming through and thinning from below, thinning all the 8 inches and smaller time and time again, right? Because we were worried about ladder fuels for fire component, which makes a lot of sense. However, that meant that we were leaving larger and larger and larger diameter trees on the landscape. And here we sit today, right? With this ever growing large diameter trees that are out there. So the question is really about volume. In ponderosa pine, can we get it below 75 and or 80? That's the ideal for me. I don't let perfection get in the way of progress. There are some people in the room, I won't say names, but they will want you to get below 50 square feet of basal area. And at that point, it becomes very few trees per acre. And most of us bought our properties in the mountains because we want to screen, we want to be in the mountains, you know, with trees and everything else. And so it's really your personal preference versus mine, and kind of thinking about, should a fire come through, how likely are we to have changed fire behavior if we do a clumpy individual openness designed by prescription? Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, there's 3 questions from online, but I also just want to put in a plug for that question. As an ecologist myself, it depends, right, on where you are for how many trees you're gonna take. So I highly recommend reaching out to one of the organizations in the room, the Watershed Center, Boulder Conservation Districts, Colorado State Forest Service, who can come on site and provide recommendations for you. And many of you are part of our projects already, so that's awesome. But
good plug.
Just wanted to getting someone on site with eyeballs is really important as well.
And it matters if you've got lodgepole or pondo or a mix or something in other species, Doug fir and aspens and everything else. So that's why it's so important.
And then I have to be the online person.
Yeah, by all means. Fire. Here, do you want the
rapid fire.
Do you need this?
No, I can.
Okay.
I was a soccer captain. I
Okay.
got it. Couple rapid fire questions from online. One is, how much water should I water my trees with?
Oh, that's so tough. How much water? The rule of thumb is 10 gallons per diameter inch every single week during the growing months, and that's for urban forests. You could never get that, right? So again, I try to say, don't let perfection get in the way of progress. As much as you can get on them will be a benefit, certainly in a year like this.
I am so impressed you had an equation off the top of your head for that. I was like, some water, you know? Another great question about furvinones, that semiochemical that Dan was talking about earlier, the packets that are stapled up onto trees. Would my neighbors need to participate in putting furvinone on their trees in order to make it effective?
Great question. So did everybody hear that? Like, yep. So the short answer is We want everybody to play the game, right? We're stronger together. And you should know that if you're gonna use semiochemicals to push beetles or repel beetles from your stand, I would maybe do the good neighbor thing and let your neighbors know, hey, I'm going to apply this, which means that more beetles are gonna be flying to your stand. So all it does is just push them away, right? And so that works when we're battling beetles coming from an open space or from the US Forest Service, or, where there's, maybe less of a human component. But again, that's why we work with large HOAs to kind of say, hey, we're better all together. And can we all use this in concert so that we can push the beetles onto a different area? And ideally, we would match that up with traps to say, in our meadows, aspen stands, areas where we know mountain pine beetle will not go, we will hang these traps and push them out of our forest and into these open areas and into traps. That's the best case scenario. I don't have liberty to, yeah.
I think, I'm gonna try to combine two questions.
Yeah.
One is about what caused earlier infestations to subside. And then, I guess, I don't know, I'm connecting in my brain. Do warmer temperatures, cause an increase in mountain beetle?
Okay, so I'll take the first one. What happened in the past and why did we see these epidemics build and wane? And the short of the answer is that as our forests become more and more kind of a monoculture, all getting into these susceptible size classes, we're removing a lot of the species and age diversity within our forests, right? We're all getting bigger. And in the absence of management and fire, what do we got? An ever-building volume of fuel. And so in the past, when we didn't have over 3 million people living in the wildland-urban interface, we could do some of these treatments and come through and create some of these breaks that allowed us to be able to manage some of these outbreaks on our time. Or we had oscillating periods. Those of us that have lived in Colorado long enough remember from 1980 through 87, it was this incredible wet period in time. And so trees have this amazing amount of defenses. And we saw very, very little bark beetle activity during that window. And since then, we've kind of got this up, down, oscillating temperature and precipitation regime that makes it really hard to be a tree. And so as we get further and further away and we're starting to see these temperatures climb and climb and climb, we're seeing tree condition go down, tree vigor go down, and tree defenses are reduced, and the ability for bark beetles to build and build is that much greater. Then lastly, temperature regimes, and does that matter? I think we've already touched on that a little bit, but in short, that undoubtedly temperature is driving most of the activity that we see today, in part because of that tree defense line of thinking. And so as temperatures are warming, we no longer calculate in the algorithm a 5, 10, or 15% reduction in population based on overwintering mortality. It just doesn't happen. And in fact, this year, if you remember, it was incredibly warm. It has been, right? But remember back in January, we had that incredibly cold window. We saw adults that were still alive up until that cold period that was in January. So they were laying their eggs or had spent their whole egg allotment and were just hanging out alive, crawling into the bark until that January period where we started to see adults die back. And since then, we rarely see adults under the bark that are still alive. Question.
Given that the pine beetle on average travels from west to east, presumably because that's the average prevailing wind.
Yep.
And you have a large number of trees that you want to protect and have the resources to buy further for all of it. It makes sense to protect on the west side of the stands or the east side of stands or matter or.
Yep, so the question is, with budgetary concerns, you might not be able to do your entire lot. Are you better off to focus your efforts thinking about prevailing winds, maybe west to east? And I've done some of this work in Park County, trying to build what I call a picket fence on the kind of prevailing wind side or the windward side to say, okay, what can we get as much vermin on that side? And the wind will then draw it through the stand. And it does look like that works. And again, you've got to kind of look at how your property is positioned adjacent to other properties, of course. But can you somehow build up a little bit of a picket fence? The short of the answer is yes. And Synergy sells these 9-gram bubble packets that's made specifically for that, to spread out the 6 grams across a broader range. And what I've done on a 75-acre lot in Park County was I just started to put a big swath of verbenone out there to see what it would look like, and then sprinkled it less and less as I got further away from that windward side. And sure enough, it has held for the last 10 years.
Do you mean upwind sign?
Yes,
The upwind side.
upwind side, thank you.